If there ever was a Yukon basketball encyclopedia, he is in this interview, and let me tell you, it is not me. It is Rob Carolla. He's executive administrator at the league offices of Pro Volleyball Federation, and he is my next guest on the sports media podcast On to Something. I'm Bryan Fenley. Rob, thanks so much for being a part of this.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Happy to join you.
How photographic is your memory in recalling actual events, plays with Yukon basketball over the years?
I think I've been fortunate to be around it for quite a bit. When I got there, they didn't win. They hadn't won any national championships yet. So, dating myself a little bit, but I've been fortunate to see all six of their titles in person. I think the first one's always one of the best because the Huskies were not expected to win that against Duke in 1999. But there's a lot of great moments. I was fortunate to stumble onto a career at UConn. Didn't know that athletic communications existed, but at the end of my freshman year, got involved in the athletic communications department, worked there for 3 years, a lot of hours a week as anytime I could. If I wasn't in class, I was checking into the athletic communications office. So it helps you remember things. I joke sometimes with friends and family that, sometimes I forget the basics, of everyday life because my head is cluttered with UConn or baseball statistics or other sports that I've done over the years. So but it's something I've really enjoyed.
At your earliest ages, when do you recall that you were good with numbers?
I think from a pretty young age, I still have a couple of baseball was the first sport I loved as a kid. And I remember my older sister getting me a couple of books. She got me the Bill James Baseball Encyclopedia, which at the time was a pretty big deal. And I remember combing through that and reading about, every baseball statistic out there. And now it's a lot more readily accessible because you can just Google it and look it up. But back then, you had to kind of educate yourself. And, once I got to college and realized that athletic communications and sports information also was a career that was a lot of numbers, if you're trying to tell a story with numbers and statistics, that was something that I was like, hey, this might be something I want to do for a career.
There must be a number of ways that your personality jives with what you do. How has your personality become lockstep with what you get to do, even in college and then now today?
I think big thing about PR and media relations and really working in athletics as an administrator is it's about the people. So, I've always been a people person. I've always been enjoyed meeting new people and speaking to people. I still talk to some colleges here. I'm in the Dallas Fort Worth area, and I've spoken to SMU and TCU sports management classes about what I do and the profession. I think those relationships that you build in this profession are something that really drew me to it, and that's something that I think I've got a knack for. I've met some great coaches over the years that I've said, if they weren't a head coach, they'd probably be a politician because they can go out and shake hands and kiss babies and, build those kind of things in the public space. But I really love the relationship and people part of this business. I have a lot of good friends around the country that I've met through work that have become friends, not just colleagues, but friends.
Speaking of coaches, you've been coached up by a lot of people. You've coached a lot of people as far as talking to the next generation. You also have been a baseball coach, and there's that aspect too. What side of you comes out when, especially with your sons and being having been a baseball coach for them?
I think as they get older, when they're real young, I've been fortunate. It's actually I've done it now for 18 seasons between the two boys that I have, and no longer doing my older son, but still doing my younger son. And it's when they're real little, you look at them and you just hoping that they don't build sandcastles in the infield. But as they get older, I try to hold them more responsible for what we're trying to do there. I mean, I want them to have fun. I want them to love the game, but in the same sense, it's competitive. I want to support their teammates. I'm big on sportsmanship. But I tell my son, hey, when I'm out here, I'm coach and not your dad. And then when we're done, let's go back to being your dad, So I want them to learn responsibility out of it. Like I said, good sportsmanship. I have no tolerance for that. And I try to point that out when I see it in professional sports too, with both my boys. When I see somebody doing things the right way. As a Yankees fan, I was a big fan of Derek Jeter because of the way he carried himself. One of the best athletes I've dealt with over the years was when I was at the Big East. I worked with a couple times with Larry Fitzgerald. And he was so gracious, so polite. Because he was brought up the right way. And I try to instill that same kind of character building on my boys.
There's the way in which you're impacting your boys in their childhood. Where are the similarities and where are the differences between the way you were raised and what you've learned from your own childhood and that you can then dispel on your boys today?
Yeah, I mean, my grandparents came over from Italy, you know, through Ellis Island, the whole, the stereotypical immigrant coming from one country to another. My grandfather actually came here first, had to work to support enough to raise enough money to bring my grandmother over from Italy. So hard work has kind of been always been a hallmark of what I do. I'm very protective of my work ethic and I work hard at what I do regardless of which stop I've been in my career and I try to instill that on them too it's not and it's hard nowadays. Everything is so readily available. Their entire life is in their hand on their phone. So it makes it challenging. But I say to my older ones sometimes, like, you're not going to go to college and be the guy who doesn't know how to cook yourself a meal or wash your clothes or whatever. Because I had friends like that when I went to college, who were asking me like, well, how do you do this? And you try to help them, but you're just dumbfounded that they didn't know that when they were, freshman or sophomore in college.
Like, how do you boil water? Like the
Yeah.
littlest things in life can be so challenging. With how hard you work and with how that work ethic has been bestowed on your kids, when do you allow yourself to sort of, with everything you're doing work-wise, to break away and allow yourself to just kind of be with where you are right now, with the grind that can come with working and always be focused on what's coming up and what's next, but for you to get back to just seeing what's around you and being that observational self, which I can tell you are.
Well, I think it's a couple things. In sports, it's hard, because for a lot of people, what I do for a living is their hobby. They're sports fans, but that's my job. And it's not a 9 to 5, 5 day a week job, especially in season. It's 7 days a week. Every time you have a match or a game, at 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, whatever time it is, you have to be available. So it does take up a lot of time, but at the end of the day, I say this a lot to people is like, and people who are coming up that I've mentored, we have to remember where we work. We work in sports, it's not life or death. We're not curing cancer here. We need to keep it all in perspective. And that's what I try to do. And I try to tell my staff to do that. I've told staff over the years, many years ago, when I was starting to get a little older, out of my 20s, I took that first vacation where I just completely disconnected, and it was fantastic. I'm a huge advocate of that. I tell staff at times, you're going on vacation, great. I may email you to keep you in the loop, but do not respond. You know, I've had interns over the years when my kids were real young, and babies, and I'd be up late at night, when they weren't sleeping or whatever, and I would say to my interns, hey, I'm a dad who's catching up on emails at 9, 10 o'clock at night because I've been with my kids during the day. I don't expect you to answer. I didn't want them to think that they had to impress the boss by, responding to my email at 10 o'clock at night. That's just me trying to catch up. And now, fortunately, if I ever get in that situation now, I love in email now where you can you schedule emails to go at certain times,
Yes.
and so I do that now because I try to be cognizant of other people's lives on my staff. I don't want them to be getting emails from me from 9 or 10 o'clock at night. I'd rather schedule it to go at 8:30 in the morning so that boom, they get it and there's their answer. But I think vitally important for people to do that. Whatever your career is, I think it's really important to step away. I think in this country, sometimes, some of the European countries and other places in the world, they do it better than us. There are countries in Europe that take a whole month off. And they're still pretty productive. So I think it's important to keep it all in perspective. And, we only live once, so let's work hard, but let's also enjoy, what we've got.
You're very forthright with your communication skills. I wish more people had that kind of savviness about them, but to know where you are communication wise as far as the importance of it and coming across and letting people know what's going on. What do you feel like befits the qualities of a good communicator?
I think first off is being able to do this. What we're doing right now is just talking to people. It's so easy to text, it's so easy to email. I think, either picking up the phone or just, hey, let's grab lunch. Can I come by your office? That type of thing. I think that's vitally important nowadays. I've said it to my boys, I've said it to some staff I've had over the years, and when, I've had full-time postgraduate interns and we'd have an event, and there'd be some kind of social function around it. And I would tell them, don't let me see you sitting at a table just with people from the office,
I
you
love
know, because they're postgraduate 1 year interns and they need to be networking. They need to be building their network of people. And I don't want to see them just taking that easy way out and, only talking to the people that they work with every day. So I think that part of it, and I think really nowadays in 2025, that's how you stand out. You have to be a good writer. That's something that's challenging for some people nowadays, but also you have to be able to talk to people. You have to be able to communicate verbally and in person. I'm amazed sometimes by how much I have to sometimes remind college students or younger people, like, okay, look up, look at me, like when you're talking to someone, because they're so used to it. I jokingly call it the heads down generation,
Yeah.
because everybody's down there looking at their phone. But it's one of those things that I think it's important to be able to do it and to not be intimidated. It takes practice, you know. Um, there's a great line, that I heard one time that Jerry Seinfeld had that basically said, the number one fear is public speaking, and number two is death,
Yes.
and that means you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. I'd rather be giving the eulogy. So,
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you there. And it's another instance of like when you do it and you practice public speaking, it gets easier, just like you're talking about when you're
mhm.
practicing and networking. And you brought up that anecdote about kids and making sure that they go out and meet new people and not just hang out with those who they know. How do you feel like you to this day are challenging yourself and getting yourself regularly out of your comfort zone?
I think just doing different things. I'm always willing to take on some new stuff here with Pro Volleyball Federation where I'm working now. It's we're going into our third season. We're a startup, and I'm fortunate that I've worked for collegiate conferences where a lot of that league office experience can transfer to this job. But there are some other things that I still am doing now that I wasn't, an expert in. But to me, it's, hey, okay, I'll take that. Let me do it because I have confidence in myself and be able to get the job done that I can figure it out. And it gets harder as you get older. I mean, I think it's also important as you get older and you talk about getting out of your comfort zone. I think it's also knowing that when you have someone on staff who just is a little better at it than you are. We have some people that are creatives and stuff like that that are great at what they do. And I just know, like, hey, that's your deal. That let you do it, you handle it and go from there. And I've done social media, I've done that stuff, but I'm also okay giving it up because the 25-year-old I might have on staff or the 30-year-old I might have on staff, that's all they know, and they're pretty good at it.
You said there's some things that get harder as you get older. What gets easier as you get older?
Um, I think probably just realizing, like I said earlier, a little bit of that this is not life or death. You go through a lot of experiences, highs and lows in your life, that kind of thing that you deal with. And at the end of the day, especially professionally, like what we're doing, it's not life or death. And you have to keep it all in perspective. And you have to be intentional about it. It's a hard thing to do sometimes to remind yourself of that. And I'm not always right there, and there's times where I get frustrated too, but you have to just kind of it helps you get through the day and realizing you can also at the end of the day put it aside and be present for your family or be present with your friends or whatever it may be.
How have you had to use that resilience, that determination to really get yourself into a place that you are now? I mean, everyone in their own different ways has the highs and the lows, but for you to to really kind of find that determination, how has that allowed you to overcome things?
You know, I think that I've always kind of looked at it like, you know, you got to look out for yourself from that standpoint in terms of like, you have friends, you have family, you have a support system that can help you, but you have to do it. Starting in 2017, when I left the Big 12, um, I had several job challenges. I worked at a place that was only for a set period of time. I knew it was going to be for a year and a half when I worked on college football's 150th anniversary, and that ended earlier than it should have, right? So that's one challenge. Then I get a job working in the XFL with the Dallas Renegades here, and we get shut down due to COVID. I was on a staff call with 500 other people that all got laid off at the same time,
Wow.
and then going to another company that had a massive corporate downsizing, and you have to deal with that and you just got to keep moving. And I think you asked about things that you need to learn as you get older. When I went through that, you take advantage of the things you can take advantage of. I did some consulting, and that's how I ended up at PVF. I take advantage of things like the unemployment that's out there, because it helps to pay the bills, that type of thing. And just kind of realizing, I think the first time you go through it, and I've talked to friends who've lost their jobs and tried to almost counsel them a little bit on some of this because fortunately or unfortunately, I have multiple times of experience with it, but nothing that was in my control,
Yeah.
and just telling them like you're going to get through it, it's going to be fine. I'm fortunate that I'm not in a position where I'm going to lose my house or anything like that, and it helps you keep it in perspective for sure.
Why do you think sometimes it's hard for people to ask for help in certain situations like that, where it really is hard for them to do that?
I mean, I think part of it, at least just speaking personally, is you don't want to burden other people. Everybody's kind of got their own problems. And again, I think one of the ways to really keep it in good perspective is to think to yourself like, hey, it could be a lot worse. I mean, I have good days and bad days, absolutely, but my kids are healthy, I'm healthy, I've got family members and friends around that, are relatively healthy. And, you see some of these other news stories or see other things where families are going through a lot. They've lost a loved one, or there's been some tragedy in their life, or they have a very difficult disease. And, you know, you have to remind yourself of that because, at the end of the day, I can get up in the morning. I mean, getting older, not as much fun because it's, a little harder to sometimes, I don't have the energy I did when I was 25, but, but, other than that, we're doing okay.
How do you remind your kids? And by the way, you look closer to 25 to whatever you think you are. So just so you know. But how do you remind your kids through your actions that you love them?
I think it's just always being there. I mean, there's a lot of days. I mean, I have a 15-year-old, he's a teenager, you know. I think there's a lot of days that you know, he loves me, but would prefer to I don't bother him, you know. I've gotten the line of, well, yeah, but Dad, it was different when you were this age, And I'm like, you're right, it was. but there was different challenges. But a lot of the stuff is still the same, and just being there. I mean, I'm not a big talker with my kids in terms of like, we're not going to have some big life lessons discussion, but I just want them to know that I'm here if they ever need me.
Who's been there for you when you've needed them?
Uh, I think there's been a lot of people over the years, I could say family, I could say friends, it probably depends on the situation. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of great people. And I've been fortunate to have a lot of family members. I'm one of five kids, but I have four sisters. So I joke that you know, I guess I learned how to treat women because you have four older sisters, and you want you be, even if you're the youngest, which I was, you're still protective of your siblings, So just try to be helpful where I can. But they were very much, um, they looked out for me.
What's the negative and positive of being the youngest?
You learn how to behave. I mean, my mother was a single parent, so it was me always trying to be helpful. And, there's a little bit of a gap between my three older sisters and my sister who's a year and a half older than me. But I think the advantage is you learn how to behave, you get some direction because they've been there, and stuff like that. So um, I think there's pluses and minuses. I'm the youngest now, so that's good. As you get older, it's good to be the youngest.
You keep talking about you're getting older, but you don't look it. And it's like you're, as I said, you're closer to 25 than anything else. But you mentioned your mom and what she's had to go through raising, as a single mom, a bunch of kids. Where do you feel like she made the greatest sacrifice for you, and how much respect and admiration do you have for what she went through and what you learned from that?
I probably can't put it into words, the amount of respect I have for what she did because she was in an abusive relationship. And when I was 12 years old, she took me and my sister, my three older sisters were already out of the house. She took me and my sister, and we just left in the middle of the day. And, she had nothing. She was a stay-at-home mom. My dad at the time had his own business, so it was a family business. And she just started from scratch. When I was in high school, she worked three jobs. She worked a daytime job, she worked 3 nights a week cleaning offices, and on the weekends, she worked in a hospital. She sacrificed a lot to give us a better life and to not have us grow up in an abusive home because I think she probably saw what me looking back on it did. When I look back on it at the time, it was good it was good timing as far as that because she probably worried that I would eventually come to blows with my father and it could escalate,
For sure.
you know. So it's never anything I've been afraid to talk about, but it's something that, my mom has, she's still alive. She's 87 years old, lives on her own, has her own, condo, and, was very proud of that. Very proud that she's been able to be self-supportive. She doesn't need to rely on me or my sisters, to support herself. And other than the regular health challenges that you get when you're 87 years old, she's doing great. So, what she did, you know, 40 years ago or however many years ago it was, um, was immensely brave, immensely courageous, and immensely strong for her to do that. When you had no idea where we were going to go next.
How does she tell you to this day how proud she is of the man that you've become since those moments?
My mom's not a woman of a lot of words, but she's always been tried to convey, that she's proud of me, that she, respects what I do. When I work events, I've worked a lot of events over my career. She's always asking me, am I going to see you on TV? Because sometimes I'll be sitting courtside at a basketball game because of my job or the volleyball match or whatever it may be, and I always make sure to tell her if I am going to be on TV because she likes to see me. But she, there's probably not a words conveyed, but I think it's just one of those kind of understood things. As she's gotten older, I've noticed more words in the birthday cards I get and things like that. So I appreciate that.
I got one last question for you. Rob Kroll is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. How much would you gather that the best gift that your mom has given you is the work ethic that you saw from her and how you've carried that with you today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she did a lot. She sacrificed a lot for us, for me and my sister, so I think every parent wants to do that, make your kids' lives better. I try to give my kids more experiences. At the end of the day, I mean, how much do the kids nowadays really need, right? They have clothes, they have food. My son might want the new Nintendo Switch or something, and he's gonna have to wait on that. But beyond that, there's not really a lot they're worried about. I mean, when I was 13, 14, 15 years old, like my oldest son is now, freshman in high school, I was worried about having enough clothes for school,
Yeah.
and you don't want your kids to have that. So you want to make it better for them. And, that's kind of my goal. That's why I go the experience route because I want them to have experiences. I've integrated them into some of the things I've been able to do work wise. My oldest son, there's a bowl game here in North Texas. He's worked a couple times because a friend of mine that runs the operations for it. So, he'll help be a media assistant or a ball kid or whatever. My younger son at the PVF All-Star match was one of the ball shaggers,
Oh,
and he's sitting right at the net, but he's zipping back and forth, getting involved in doing that. And, I want them to remember those things. I want to enjoy those things. And it's not always sports related. I might take them, you know, uh, the industry convention that I go to annually for college sports communicators is every other year it's in Orlando. So a couple years ago, took the boys down there and we did the theme parks, after it was over. And again, I don't know. I give all the credit in the world to people that go to Disney every single year. I could never do that, but it's something you want to take your kids to at least once, right? And I want to make those memories with them so they look back on it and think fondly about it.
very last one. How many rides did they try to convince you to go on when you were there?
All of them. Well, my younger one is a thrill seeker, so he likes roller coasters. Dad does not like roller coasters. So I went to there was a couple that he went on, and I went on a couple that were good, but then there's a couple that I was like, I would wait in line with him and say, okay, you're going to go on this one. Once he was tall enough to do it himself, he was fine with it. But he got on a big coaster at Disneyland and thought, wow, this is pretty great. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to watch you from here. So it was but it was fun. As long as he have has fun, that's really all that matters. It's it can be exhausting, but what do they say? You'll sleep when you're dead, right? So I'll worry about that later.
Well, you might not be the thrill seeker in the form of riding roller coasters, but certainly it is a thrill to have you on this conversation platform, the Sports Media Podcast, and obviously it's a thrill to see what you're doing with Pro Volleyball Federation. Rob Kroll, I'm Bryan Fenley. Rob, thanks so much for being here and chatting with me.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Always a pleasure.